Hello everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. The year was 1972 and the small town of Algona, Iowa, population barely 6,000, existed as one of those quintessential Midwestern communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Nestled in Kossuth County in the heart of Iowa's farming country, Algona was the kind of place where doors went unlocked. Children played outside until dark without supervision, and the most exciting event of the week might be Friday night football or Sunday service at one of the town's many churches. The landscape stretched flat in every direction, endless fields of corn and soybeans interrupted only by the occasional farmhouse, grain elevator, or water tower. Life moved slowly here, deliberately, predictably. People worked hard, raised their families, attended community events, and trusted their neighbors. It was a town built on handshake deals and unspoken codes of conduct that had governed behavior for generations. The business district occupied just a few blocks along the main street, where locally owned shops served the farming families from miles around. There was Sampson's Drug Store, where teenagers gathered at the soda fountain; Peterson's Hardware, where farmers bought their tools and supplies; the Algona Hotel, a modest two-story building that had stood since the early 1900s. And on the edge of the commercial district, where residential streets began to take over, stood the livestock growers' cold storage, a meat locker facility that served as an essential service for local farmers and hunters who needed a place to store and process their meat. The cold storage facility wasn't much to look at from the outside, a simple rectangular building constructed of cinder blocks painted white, with a single Blasco at the front and a few small windows. Inside, however, it was a marvel of refrigeration technology for its time, containing multiple walk-in freezers and coolers where hundreds of pounds of beef, pork, venison, and other meats hung from steel hooks or sat wrapped in white butcher paper on metal shelves. The temperature inside the freezers stayed well below zero, preserving the meat for months at a time. The business was vital to the local economy, allowing farmers to slaughter their livestock and store the meat without spoiling, and providing hunters with a place to process their deer and other game during hunting season. The cold storage was owned and operated by Gordon Bass, a well-respected businessman in his late 50s who had run the facility for nearly 15 years. Bass was known throughout the community as honest, hard-working, and scrupulously fair in his dealings. He charged reasonable rates, never shortchanged his customers on weight, and took pride in the cleanliness and efficiency of his operation. He lived modestly with his wife in a small house just a few blocks from the business, and they were active members of the community, attending church regularly and contributing to local charities. Bass employed a small staff to help with the heavy work of processing meat, managing the inventory, and maintaining the refrigeration equipment. Among his employees was Darrell Williams, a 24-year-old man who had worked at the cold storage for about 2 years. Williams came from a troubled background that stood in stark contrast to the stability and respectability of his employer. Born in 1948 in Fort Dodge, Williams had experienced a difficult childhood marked by poverty, instability, and violence. His father had abandoned the family when Darrell was young, leaving his mother to raise several children on her own with little money and few prospects. The family moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough for Darrell to establish roots or lasting friendships. He struggled in school, both academically and socially, and dropped out before completing high school. As a teenager, Williams began accumulating a criminal record, starting with petty theft and vandalism, then escalating to burglary and assault. He was arrested multiple times, spent time in juvenile detention, and by the time he reached his early 20s, had already served time in prison for breaking into a hardware store. After his release, he drifted around northern Iowa, taking odd jobs when he could find them, sleeping in his car or crashing with acquaintances, and supplementing his meager income through small-time thefts and scams. Despite this troubled history, Gordon Bass had taken a chance on Williams when he applied for work at the cold storage in 1970. Bass believed in giving people second chances, in the redemptive power of honest work and stable employment. Williams seemed grateful for the opportunity, showing up on time, doing the heavy lifting without complaint, and generally keeping to himself. He wasn't particularly friendly or talkative, but he got the work done. Bass paid him a fair wage, and for a while, it seemed like Williams might finally be turning his life around. But beneath the surface, Williams harbored resentments and antisocial impulses that he kept carefully hidden from his employer and coworkers. He resented authority figures, resented people he perceived as having more than him, resented the whole social order that he felt had denied him opportunities and treated him unfairly since childhood. He had learned to mask these feelings, to present a facade of normalcy when necessary, but inside a dark anger simmered constantly. By early 1972, Williams had been making plans. He had access to the cold storage facility, knew the layout intimately, understood the schedule and routines. He knew that Bass often worked alone, especially in the early morning hours or late afternoon when business was slow. He knew where the money was kept, how much cash Bass typically had on hand from customer payments. And he knew that the isolated nature of the business, set somewhat apart from other buildings on a quiet street, made it an ideal target. Williams had also formed a partnership with another troubled young man named Robert Lewis, who was 21 years old and had his own history of criminal behavior. Lewis came from a similarly unstable background, had dropped out of school young, and had been in and out of trouble with the law since his early teens. The two men had met through the loose network of petty criminals and drifters that existed on the margins of small-town Iowa life, and they recognized in each other a willingness to cross lines that most people wouldn't. They began spending time together, drinking, using drugs, and talking about ways to get money quickly without having to work for it. Williams told Lewis about the cold storage, about the cash that Gordon Bass kept there, about how easy it would be to rob the place. At first, they talked about it as a simple robbery. They'd wait until Bass was alone, threaten them with a weapon, take the money and disappear. But as they discussed the plan over several weeks, drinking and getting high together, their ambitions grew darker. Williams expressed his resentment toward Bass, whom he viewed as a representative of the middle-class respectability that had always been denied to him. He talked about wanting to do more than just rob the place. He wanted to send a message, to strike back at the system that had oppressed him, to prove that he was powerful and could not be controlled. Lewis, eager to prove himself and excited by the transgressive nature of what they were planning, agreed to go along with whatever Williams wanted to do. Neither man seriously considered the consequences. Neither man thought about the families who would be destroyed, the lives that would be shattered, the trauma that would ripple through the entire community. They thought only of themselves, of their immediate desires, of the thrill of committing an act of ultimate violence. On the morning of March 28, 1972, Gordon, early as he always did, had breakfast with his wife and drove the short distance to the cold storage facility. It was a Tuesday, and he expected it to be a relatively slow day. The weather was cold but typical for late March in northern Iowa, when winter reluctantly gave way to spring. Bass unlocked the front door, turned on the lights, and began his usual routine of in the freezers to make sure the temperatures were holding steady, reviewing the inventory sheets and preparing for the few customers he expected that day. Also working that day was a young employee named Susan Layton, a 19-year-old woman who had been hired just a few months earlier to help with office work and customer service. Susan came from a good family in Algona, was popular and well-liked, and was working at the cold storage to earn money while she took classes at the local community college. She had her whole life ahead of her, plans to finish her degree, maybe become a teacher, get married someday, raise a family. She was the kind of bright, friendly young woman that everyone in town knew and thought well of. Her parents adored her, her friends cherished her, and her presence at the cold storage had been a positive addition, bringing energy and cheerfulness to the sometimes dreary work of the meat locker business. Susan arrived at the cold storage around 9 o'clock that morning, parking her car in the small lot beside the building, and entering through the front door with a smile and a cheerful greeting for Mr. She hung up her coat, settled in at the small desk in the front office area, and began sorting through paperwork and preparing to receive customers. The morning passed quietly. A few farmers came in to pick up meat they had stored. Bass helped them load their packages into their trucks, and Susan processed the payments and updated the inventory records. The phone rang occasionally with customers calling to check on their orders or schedule processing times. Everything seemed normal, routine, peaceful. But outside, Darrell Williams and Robert Lewis were preparing to shatter that peace forever. Williams had called in sick that morning, telling Bass he wasn't feeling well and wouldn't be able to come to work. Bass had accepted this without question. Williams wasn't the most reliable employee, but he wasn't so unreliable as to raise immediate suspicion. What Bass didn't know was that Williams was using the day off to finalize his plan to rob and murder him. Williams and Lewis spent the morning drinking and using methamphetamine, working themselves into a state of agitation and false courage. They gathered their weapons. Williams carried a .22 caliber pistol he had stolen from a house burglary months earlier, and Lewis had a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade. They discussed the plan one more time. They would enter the cold storage through the back door, which Williams knew was often left unlocked for deliveries. They would surprise Bass and anyone else who happened to be there, force them into one of the back rooms, take the money from the safe, and then kill everyone present to eliminate witnesses. The casual way they discussed murder, as if they were planning nothing more serious than a shoplifting expedition, revealed the profound emptiness and moral bankruptcy that had consumed both men. They felt no empathy, no hesitation, no recognition of the fundamental wrongness of what they were about to do. The methamphetamine amplified their antisocial impulses, stripping away whatever thin veneer of civilization might have remained, leaving only predatory instinct and rage. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they drove to the cold storage in Lewis's battered Chevrolet, parking on a side street about a block away where the car wouldn't be immediately visible from the main road. They walked to the building through the back alley, moving casually, trying not to attract attention. The street was quiet. Most people were at work or home having lunch. Williams tried the back door, found it unlocked as he expected, and they slipped inside. The back area of the cold storage was utilitarian and cold, with concrete floors, metal shelving, and the massive doors to the walk-in freezers. The air smelled of raw meat and the chemical tang of refrigerant. The low hum of the refrigeration compressors provided constant background noise. Williams led Lewis through the back area toward the front office, moving carefully, listening. They could hear voices from the front, Gordon Bass talking to Susan Layton about something. Their conversation relaxed and casual. Williams pulled out his pistol, checked to make sure it was loaded, and gestured for Lewis to follow him. They moved through the doorway into the main workspace, and then into the front office area. Gordon Bass looked up from the paperwork he was reviewing with Susan and saw Williams standing there with a gun in his hand. For a moment, confusion crossed his face. Williams was supposed to be homesick, and why was he holding a weapon? Then understanding and fear dawned simultaneously. "Darrell, what?" Bass began, but Williams cut him off. "Shut up," Williams said, his voice flat and cold. "Get your hands where I can see them. Both of you." Susan Layton gasped, her flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. She had never experienced violence, had never been threatened, had lived her whole life in the protective cocoon of a safe, orderly community. The sudden presence of armed men in the cold storage, the gun pointed at her and Mr. Bass, shattered her sense of reality. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. Bass raised his hands slowly, trying to remain calm, trying to think of a way to defuse the situation. He had known Williams was troubled, but he had never imagined he was capable of this. "Darrell, listen," Bass said carefully. "If you need money, we can work something out. You don't need to do this. Put the gun down and we'll talk." Williams laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Tuck, I'm done talking. I'm done with all of you. Robert, tie them up." Lewis pulled out a roll of duct tape he had brought and approached Susan first. She shrank back against the wall, trembling violently, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't hurt us, please." Lewis ignored her pleading, grabbed her wrists roughly and began wrapping them with tape. He pulled it tight enough to cut into her skin, making her cry out in pain. Then he forced her to sit on the floor and taped her ankles together. Bass watched helplessly, his mind racing, trying to think of some way to save the young woman who worked for him, trying to find some words that would reach the humanity in Williams and Lewis. But there was no humanity left to reach. After securing Susan, Lewis approached Bass and repeated the process, taping his wrists and ankles, forcing him to sit on the floor next to Susan. Bass didn't resist. He knew that any struggle might provoke Williams into shooting them immediately. His best hope was to cooperate, to stay calm, to wait for an opportunity. Williams stood over them, the gun in his hand, a strange expression on his face, part excitement, part anxiety, part something darker that neither Bass nor Susan could identify. He seemed to be savoring his power over them, enjoying their fear. "The safe," Williams said. "Open it." "It's in the back office," Bass said. "I'll need my hands free to work the combination." Williams considered this, then nodded to Lewis, who cut the tape binding Bass's wrists, but kept the gun trained on him while he did so. Williams gestured with his pistol toward the back office, and Bass got awkwardly to his feet, his ankles still bound, and shuffled in that direction. The back office was small and cramped, containing a desk, filing cabinets, and a small safe set into the wall. Bass knelt in front of the safe, his hands shaking slightly as he worked the combination dial. Behind him, Williams stood close, the gun pointed at the back of Bass's head. The safe opened with a metallic click. Inside were several metal cash boxes containing the day's receipts and the petty cash Bass kept on hand, probably around $2,000 in total. Not a fortune by any means, but a decent amount of money. Williams grabbed the boxes and shoved them into a duffel bag Lewis had brought. "Is that all?" Williams demanded. "That's everything," Bass said. "That's all the money here." Williams stared at him, as if trying to determine whether he was lying. Then he seemed to make a decision. "Get up," he said. "We're going to the freezer." Bass felt ice flood his veins. The freezer, he knew what that meant. He knew they weren't planning to rob the cold storage and leave. They were planning to kill him and Susan. To lock them in the freezer where their bodies wouldn't be discovered for hours or days, giving Williams and Lewis time to get away. "Listen to me," Bass said, turning to face Williams, trying one last time to appeal to whatever conscience might exist in the young man he had tried to help. "You worked for me for 2 years. I gave you a job when nobody else would. I treated you fairly. You don't want to do this. If you take the money and leave right now, I won't call the police. I'll tell them I don't know who robbed me. You and Robert can disappear, start over somewhere else. But if you hurt us, they'll hunt you down. They'll find you, and your life will be over. Think about that. Think about your future." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in Williams's eyes. Some hint of doubt or hesitation. But it passed quickly, extinguished by the drugs in his system, the anger in his heart, and the commitment he had already made to this course of action. He had crossed too many lines already to turn back now. Williams said, jabbing the gun toward Bass. "Now." Bass shuffled back toward the front office, where Susan still sat on the floor, crying quietly. When she saw Bass return with Williams behind him, holding the gun, her crying intensified. "Please," she sobbed. "I won't tell anyone. I promise. Please just let us go." Lewis forced Bass to sit down again and retaped his wrists. Then Williams and Lewis had a brief, whispered conversation that Bass and Susan couldn't hear clearly, but the gestures and body language made it clear they were arguing about what to do next. Finally, Williams turned back to his captives. "We're going to lock you in the freezer for a while," he said. "Just until we're far enough away. Someone will find you eventually." It was a lie, and Bass knew it. The temperature in the walk-in freezer was well below zero. Even if they weren't shot or stabbed first, they would die of hypothermia within hours, probably sooner. And on a slow Tuesday afternoon, with no other employees scheduled and no customers expected, their bodies might not be discovered until the next morning or later. Williams and Lewis forced Bass and Susan to their feet and marched them toward the back area, toward the largest of the walk-in freezers. Susan was hysterical now. begging and pleading, promising anything, offering anything if they would just let her go. Bass tried to comfort her, tried to stay calm, tried to think of some way to escape or overpower their captors, but bound and outnumbered and facing a loaded gun, he had no options. Lewis pulled open the heavy insulated door to the freezer. Cold air billowed out, carrying the smell of frozen meat. Inside, the space was about 12 feet by 20 feet, with sides of beef and pork hanging from hooks on the ceiling, and shelves lined with wrapped packages of meat. The single light bulb in the ceiling cast harsh shadows. The temperature read -15 degrees Fahrenheit on the thermometer mounted near the door. Williams shoved Bass forward, forcing him to stumble into the freezer. Then Lewis pushed Susan in behind him. She fell to her knees on the frozen floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please," Bass said one last time, "do this." Williams raised his pistol, pointing it at Bass's chest. And then, in that frozen space, surrounded by the meat from animals that had been slaughtered for human consumption, Darrell Williams committed an act of slaughter himself. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the confined space, echoing off the metal walls and ceiling. The .22 caliber bullet in the chest, slightly left of center. Bass staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and collapsed against the shelving behind him, then slid to the floor. Blood began to spread across his shirt, dark and wet. Susan screamed a high, piercing sound of pure terror. She tried to scramble away, her movements clumsy and awkward with her ankles taped together. Williams turned the gun toward her. "No, no, no, please, God, please." Susan gasped, her words tumbling over each other. Williams fired again. The bullet hit Susan in the shoulder, spinning her around. She fell onto her side, still screaming, blood now flowing from her wound as well. Bass, grievously wounded but still conscious, tried to drag himself toward Susan, some protective instinct overwhelming even his own mortal injury. But Williams stepped forward and fired again, this time shooting Bass in the head. The older man's body went still immediately. Susan's screaming had turned to whimpering, broken sounds of pain and terror. Williams approached her as she lay on the freezer floor, bleeding and trembling. She looked up at him, her young face streaked with tears and contorted with fear. "Why?" Williams didn't answer. He aimed the pistol at her head and pulled the trigger. The gun clicked empty. He had run out of bullets. For a moment Williams stood there, staring down at the wounded young woman, the empty gun in his hand. Susan was still alive, still conscious, bleeding from her shoulder wound, looking up at him with eyes that held more hurt and confusion than hatred. Williams turned to Lewis, who had been standing in the doorway watching the shooting with a mixture of fascination and horror. "Finish her," Williams said. Lewis hesitated. Despite all his talk, despite his willingness to participate in the robbery, despite his own criminal history, he had never actually killed anyone. Robbery was one thing. Murder was something else entirely. He had watched Williams shoot two people, and the reality of it, the blood, the sounds, the smell of gunpowder mixed with the cold air and frozen meat, was different from what he had imagined. "Do it," Williams hissed. "We can't leave her alive." Lewis pulled out his hunting knife, the blade gleaming in the harsh light of the freezer. He approached Susan slowly, reluctantly. She tried to crawl away from him, leaving a trail of blood on the frozen floor. But she couldn't move fast with her injuries and her bound ankles. "Please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "Please don't." Lewis knelt beside her, the knife in his hand, and for a long moment he just stayed there, frozen himself, unable to complete the act. Williams watched impatiently from the doorway. Then Lewis closed his eyes and plunged the knife into Susan's back, between her shoulder blades, driving it in with force. Susan gasped, a wet, choking sound, and her body convulsed once, twice, then went still. Lewis pulled the knife out, and blood welled up from the wound. He stabbed her again and again, his movements becoming more frenzied, as if the repetition would somehow make it easier, would somehow erase what he was doing. When he finally stopped, breathing hard, his hands shaking, Susan Layton was dead. Williams and Lewis stood in the freezer doorway, looking at the two bodies on the floor, at the blood spreading slowly in the cold air. Gordon Bass lay on his back, his eyes open and sightless, a hole in his forehead. Susan Layton lay on her side, her young face pressed against the frozen concrete, multiple stab wounds in her back, her blood pooling around her body. Williams seemed calm, almost relaxed, as if committing double murder had relieved some terrible pressure inside him. Lewis, on the other hand, looked shaken, pale, ill. He wiped the bloody knife on his jeans, leaving dark smears on the denim. "Come on," Williams said. "We need to clean up and get out of here." They stepped out of the freezer and Williams pulled the heavy door shut, sealing Bass and Susan inside with the frozen meat. The bodies would be preserved by the cold, frozen solid within hours, waiting to be discovered. Williams and Lewis spent the next 20 minutes trying to clean up evidence of the crime. They wiped down surfaces they remembered touching, though in their drug-addled state they missed many spots. They gathered up the used duct tape and shoved it in the duffel bag with the money. They tried to mop up some of the blood that had dripped floor outside the freezer, but they did a poor job of it. They were nervous now, anxious to leave, looking over their shoulders constantly, afraid that someone would walk in and discover them. Finally, Williams decided they had done enough. They grabbed the duffel bag with the money and the evidence, took one last look around to make sure they hadn't left anything obvious behind, and slipped out the back door the same way they had entered. The street was still quiet. No one saw them leave. They walked quickly, but not too quickly, back to Lewis's car, got in, and drove away. Within minutes, they were out of Gaona, heading south on Highway 169, putting distance between themselves and the cold storage facility. Inside the freezer, Gordon, Bass, and Susan Layton lay dead, their bodies already beginning to freeze. Their lives ended for no reason beyond greed and cruelty. The afternoon passed quietly. No customers came to the cold storage, no one called. The business sat silent and apparently empty, its windows dark, its doors locked. Bass's wife began to worry when her husband didn't come home for dinner at his usual time around 5:30. He was a creature of habit, always home by 6 at the latest unless he had specifically told her he'd be working late. She called the cold storage, but there was no answer. She called again at 6:30 and again at 7. Still no answer. By 7:30, her worry had turned to genuine concern. She called one of Gordon's friends, a man named Harold Peterson who owned a hardware store downtown, and asked if he had seen Gordon that day. Peterson said he had seen him that morning, but not since. Mrs. Bass asked if Peterson would mind driving over to the cold storage to check on her husband. Maybe he had fallen or hurt himself, or maybe the phone was broken. Peterson agreed and drove to the cold storage. The building was dark, and when he tried the front door, it was locked. He peered through the windows but couldn't see anything unusual. He walked around to the back and found the back door unlocked, which struck him as odd. Bass was usually careful about security. Peterson opened the door and called out, "Gordon, you here?" No answer. He stepped inside, found a light switch, and turned on the overhead lights. The back area looked normal, cold, utilitarian, exactly as it always looked. He walked through toward the front office. "Gordon, Susan, anyone here?" Still no answer. He noticed some dark spots on the floor near one of the freezer doors. He bent down and touched one of the spots. It was sticky. He brought his finger close to his face and realized with a shock that it was blood. Peterson's heart began to pound. He looked around more carefully and saw more blood spots, a trail leading toward the large walk-in freezer. He approached the freezer door, hesitated, then pulled it open. The cold air rushed out, and with it came a sight that would haunt Harold Peterson for the rest of his life. Gordon, Bass, and Susan Layton lay on the freezer floor, their bodies already partially frozen, surrounded by blood that had turned dark and solid in the sub-zero temperature. The horror of the scene, the two people he knew, good people, murdered and discarded like the animal carcasses hanging around them, was beyond anything Peterson had ever experienced. He backed away from the freezer, his hand over his mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. Then he turned and ran toward the front office, where he knew there was a phone. With shaking hands, he dialed the operator and asked to be connected to the police. "There's been a murder," he said, his voice trembling. "2 murders. At the cold storage. You need to send someone right away." Within minutes, the Elgana Police Department responded. Within an hour, The small cold storage facility was flooded with law enforcement, local police, county sheriff's deputies, and investigators from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. The news spread through the town like wildfire. Gordon Bass murdered, Susan Layton murdered. At the cold storage, shot and stabbed, left in the freezer. The shock and horror that gripped Algona that night was profound and total. This kind of thing didn't happen here. Algona was safe. Algona was peaceful. Murders, especially brutal, execution-style murders of innocent people, belonged to big cities, to dangerous places far away, not to their quiet farming community. But now it had happened here, shattering forever the town's sense of security and innocence. The investigation began immediately, but in those first hours, the police had few leads. The crime scene told a story of violence and cruelty, but it didn't immediately reveal who had committed the murders. The back door had been left unlocked, suggesting the killers had entered that way. There was evidence of a struggle in the front office, overturned chairs, scattered papers. The safe in the back office had been opened and emptied. Blood trails and spent shell casings told part of the story, but not the whole story. Detectives began the grim work of processing the scene, photographing everything, collecting evidence, looking for fingerprints or anything else that might identify the killers. They interviewed Harold Peterson about what he had seen and when. They spoke with Mrs. Bass, who was barely coherent with grief and shock. They tried to determine who else might have been at the cold storage that day, whether anyone had seen anything suspicious. Meanwhile, in a cheap motel room somewhere south of Algona, Darrell Williams and Robert Lewis counted their money, just over $1,800, and tried to figure out their next move. They had committed double murder for less than $1,000 each, a transaction so stupid and pointless that even they, in their more sober moments, could barely comprehend it. But those sober moments were few and far between. Williams felt no remorse, only a strange satisfaction and a growing paranoia about being caught. Lewis, on the other hand, was beginning to fall apart emotionally, the reality of what he had done crashing over him in waves of guilt and horror. He kept seeing Susan Layton's face, kept hearing her voice begging for mercy, kept feeling the resistance of her flesh as he drove the knife into her back. They decided to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Algona. They drove through the night, heading toward the Missouri border, planning to eventually make their way to Kansas City or maybe further south. They had no real plan beyond running, no thought to how they would sustain themselves or what they would do when the money ran out. Back in Algona, the investigation was intensifying. By the next morning, detectives had identified Darrell Williams as a person of interest. He was an employee who had called in sick that day, suspicious timing. He had a criminal record, and when investigators checked his apartment, they found he had cleared out, taking all his belongings, which suggested flight. A witness came forward who had seen Williams and another young man, later identified as Robert Lewis, in Lewis's car near the cold storage on the afternoon of the murders. Another witness remembered seeing the same car leaving town around 2 o'clock, heading south. Police put out an all-points bulletin for Williams and Lewis, distributing their descriptions and photographs to law enforcement agencies throughout Iowa and neighboring states. The hunt was on. The manhunt for Darrell Williams and Robert Lewis quickly became the most intense law enforcement operation in northern Iowa's recent history. By the morning of March 29, less than 24 hours after the discovery of the bodies, every police department, sheriff's office, and highway patrol station in Iowa had received bulletins with photographs and descriptions of the two suspects. The bulletin described Williams as approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, 160 pounds, with brown hair and hazel eyes, and listed his criminal record including burglary and assault. Lewis was described as 5 feet 11 inches, 175 pounds, with dark blonde hair and blue eyes, with a juvenile record and recent arrests for theft. The investigation at the cold storage facility continued throughout the night and into the next day. Crime scene technicians worked methodically, documenting everything, collecting every piece of potential evidence. They found multiple fingerprints on surfaces throughout the building, on door handles, on the safe, on the desk in the front office. Many of these prints belonged to Gordon Bass and Susan Layton, as expected, but several sets appeared to match neither victim. These unknown prints were carefully lifted and preserved for comparison. The autopsy of Gordon Bass confirmed what investigators had suspected from the scene. He had been shot 3 times with a small caliber weapon, likely a .22. The first shot had struck him in the chest, piercing his left lung but missing his heart, a serious wound but not immediately fatal. The second shot had also hit his torso, this one striking his liver. The third and fatal shot had entered his forehead just right eye, penetrating his brain and causing instant death. The pathologist estimated that several minutes had elapsed between the first shots and the final head shot, meaning Bass had been conscious and aware, as he bled on the freezer floor. Knowing he was about to die, Susan Layton's autopsy revealed even more disturbing details. She had been shot once in the left shoulder with a .22 caliber weapon, a painful wound that had shattered her clavicle and damaged tissue, but again not immediately fatal. Then, while she was still alive and conscious, she had been stabbed multiple times with a large knife. The pathologist counted separate stab wounds on her back and sides. Several had penetrated deep enough to reach vital organs. The final wound had punctured her left lung and nicked her heart. Death would have come within minutes from massive internal bleeding, but those minutes would have been filled with excruciating pain and terror. The brutality of the murders shocked even experienced investigators. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of panic. This was execution, methodical and cruel. The killers had bound their victims, marched them to the freezer, and shot them down in cold blood. When the gun ran out of bullets, they had used a knife to finish what they started. And then they had closed the freezer door and walked away, as if they had done nothing more consequential than taking out the trash. As news of the murders spread beyond Algona, media attention intensified. Newspapers across Iowa ran front-page stories about the cold storage murders. Television news broadcasts featured reports from Algona, showing footage of the building surrounded by police tape, interviewing shocked residents, speculating about the killers and their motives. The story had all the elements that attracted media coverage: innocent victims, brutal violence, small-town setting, killers on the run. The people of Algona struggled to process what had happened. Vigils were organized for Gordon Bass and Susan Layton. The churches overflowed with mourners. People who had known them shared stories and memories. Bass was remembered as a kind and generous man who had employed many local people over the years, who had sponsored youth sports teams, who had never said a harsh word about anyone. Susan Layton was remembered as a bright, beautiful young woman full of promise and potential, who had volunteered at the hospital, who sang in the church choir, who had made everyone around her feel happy. The contrast between these victims, decent, hardworking, beloved members of the community, and their killers, violent, antisocial drifters with criminal records, seemed to embody a larger struggle between order and chaos, between civilization and savagery. People asked how this could happen, how someone like Darrell Williams could exist in their community without being recognized as dangerous, how someone like Gordon Bass could try to help a troubled young man only to be murdered by him in return. Susan Layton's parents were devastated beyond words. Their only daughter, their precious child, had been taken from them in the most horrible way imaginable. Mr. Layton, a quiet man who worked as a machinist at a local factory, seemed to age 10 years overnight. Mrs. Layton could barely function. Sedated by her doctor, supported by friends and family, who feared she might collapse entirely under the weight of her grief. The family struggled with not just the loss but the manner of it. The fear Susan must have felt, the pain she must have endured, the knowledge that she had died begging for mercy that never came. Gordon Bass's wife and children faced similar anguish. Bass had 2 adult children from his first marriage, both living out of state, who rushed back to Algona when they heard the news. His widow kept asking the same question over and over: why? Why would Darrell Williams do this? Gordon had given him a job, had treated him fairly, had even advanced him money when Williams claimed he needed it for rent. What had Bass done to deserve this? But of course there was no answer that would make sense, because the crime itself made no sense. Williams hadn't killed Gordon Bass because Bass had wronged him or treated him badly. He had killed Bass because Bass represented something Williams resented, because Bass had money Williams wanted, because Williams had no empathy or conscience to prevent him from killing. The reasons were simultaneously simple and incomprehensible. Meanwhile, the investigation was making progress. Detectives had searched Williams' apartment and Lewis's last known address, a room he had been renting in a boarding house in Fort Dodge. In Lewis's room, they found a receipt from a gas station in Mason City dated the day before the murders, suggesting the two men had been together and planning something. They also found a notebook containing what appeared to be rough plans for a robbery, though the cold storage wasn't specifically mentioned. More importantly, they found people who had seen Williams and Lewis in the days leading up to the murders. A bartender at a tavern in Fort Dodge remembered the two men drinking together and talking in low voices in a back booth on several occasions over the past few weeks. A clerk at a hardware store remembered Lewis buying duct tape and a hunting knife about a week before the murders. Another witness remembered seeing Williams's car parked outside Lewis's boarding house late at night multiple times. All of this evidence helped establish that Williams and Lewis had been collaborating, planning something together. Combined with the physical evidence from the crime scene and the witness who had seen them near the cold storage on the day of the murders, investigators were building a strong case that these two men were responsible for the deaths of Gordon Bass and Susan Layton. But they still needed to catch them. The first break came on March 30, 2 days after the murders. A highway patrol officer in northern Missouri spotted a vehicle matching the description of Rolett at a rest stop off Interstate 35. The officer ran the plates and confirmed it was the vehicle listed in the bulletin. He called for backup and approached carefully, hand on his weapon, unsure if the occupants were armed or how they would react. But when he looked inside the car, it was empty. Williams and Lewis had apparently stopped at the rest area, then continued on foot or gotten another vehicle. The officer searched the car and found bloody clothing stuffed under the seats, jeans with dark stains on them, a shirt with what appeared to be blood spatter. He also found the empty .22 pistol shoved into the glove compartment. Williams had apparently kept it despite it being empty, perhaps intending to get more ammunition. The discovery of the abandoned vehicle suggested that Williams and Lewis were aware they were being pursued and were trying to cover their tracks. The highway patrol set up roadblocks and checkpoints throughout the area, and local police in nearby towns were on the lookout for two men matching the suspects' descriptions. The second break came that same evening. A motel clerk in Kansas City, Missouri, recognized Williams and Lewis from photographs shown on the television news. The two men had checked into the motel earlier that afternoon, paying cash for a room, giving obviously fake names. The clerk had thought they looked nervous and suspicious even before seeing their faces on TV. When he recognized them, he immediately called the Kansas City Police Department. Within 20 minutes, Kansas City police had surrounded the motel. SWAT teams took positions around the building. Negotiators established a perimeter. Other guests were quietly evacuated from nearby rooms. The police knew they were dealing with double murderers who had already shown they were willing to kill without hesitation, and they approached the situation with extreme caution. The lead negotiator used a bullhorn to call out to the room where Williams and Lewis were staying, identifying himself as police and demanding that the occupants come out with their hands up. Inside the room, Williams and Lewis heard the announcement and immediately panicked. Lewis wanted to surrender. The past 2 days had been a waking nightmare for him, his guilt and fear growing with every hour. He had barely slept, barely eaten. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Susan Layton's face, heard her pleading voice. The money they had stolen was already half gone, spent on the motel, on food, on drugs Williams had bought to keep himself calm. Lewis knew they were to get caught eventually, and he wanted it to be over. But Williams refused to give up. He had no remorse, no guilt, only rage at the injustice of being hunted, of having his freedom threatened. He had a knife, the same knife Lewis had used to kill Susan Layton, and he was willing to fight. He talked wildly about making a run for it, about taking hostages, about going down in a blaze of glory, rather than spending the rest of his life in prison. They argued loudly enough that police outside could hear raised voices through the motel room walls. The negotiator continued calling for them to surrender, promising that if they came out peacefully no one would get hurt, that they would be treated fairly, that violence would only make their situation worse. Finally, after about 30 minutes of standoff, the door to the motel room opened. Robert Lewis stepped out, his hands raised high above his head, his face pale and streaked with tears. He walked slowly toward the police line, following shouted instructions: get on your knees, put your hands behind your head, don't move. Officers rushed forward, forced him face down on the pavement, and handcuffed him roughly. Lewis didn't resist. He actually seemed relieved to be captured, relieved that the running was over. But Darrell Williams didn't come out. Police called into the room again, ordering Williams to exit with his hands up. No response. They called again, still nothing. Fearing that Williams might be preparing for a violent confrontation or might harm himself, the SWAT team made the decision to enter the room. They breached the door with a battering ram and swept inside, weapons ready, shouting commands. They found Williams in the bathroom, standing in the shower with the knife in his hand, holding it to his own throat. His eyes were wild, his face contorted with rage and fear. "Stay back," he screamed. "Stay back or I'll do it." The officers tried to calm him, tried to talk him down, but Williams was beyond reason. He pressed the knife harder against his throat, drawing a thin line of blood. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually cut his own throat rather than surrender. Then one of the SWAT officers, a veteran with years of experience, made a quick decision. As Williams's attention was focused on the officers in front of him, this officer moved slightly to the side and fired his taser. The electrical current hit Williams in the chest, causing his muscles to contract involuntarily. He collapsed in the shower, the knife clattering to the tile floor. Officers rushed in, kicked the knife away, and pulled Williams out of the shower. They handcuffed him while he was still semi-conscious from the taser shock. Within minutes, both Darrell Williams and Robert Lewis were in custody, sitting in separate police cars, heading to the Kansas City Police Department for processing and interrogation. The news of their capture reached Algona quickly. Relief mixed with anger throughout the community. People were glad the killers had been caught, glad they couldn't hurt anyone else. But they wanted justice, wanted these men to pay for what they had done to Gordon Bass and Susan Layton. Detectives from Iowa immediately drove to Kansas City to participate in the interrogation. They wanted to hear from Williams and Lewis directly, wanted to understand exactly what had happened, wanted confessions that would ensure conviction. Robert Lewis broke almost immediately. Separated from Williams, facing experienced interrogators who alternated between sympathy and pressure, confronted with the physical evidence against him, Lewis confessed everything. He described how Williams had recruited him for the robbery, how they had planned it over several weeks, how they had used drugs to work up their courage on the day of the murders. He described entering the cold storage through the back door, surprising Bass and Susan Layton, tying them up, taking them to the freezer. Lewis's voice broke when he described the actual murders. He admitted that Williams had shot Bass and Susan, that the gun had run out of bullets, that Williams had then ordered him to finish killing Susan with the knife. He described how he had hesitated, how Williams had pressured him, how he had finally committed the act that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I didn't want to do it," Lewis said, crying openly. "I didn't want to kill her. But Darrell said we couldn't leave her alive, that she'd identify us, that we'd go to prison. I was scared, I was high, I wasn't thinking straight. And I did it. I killed her. Oh God, I killed her." The detectives listened impassively, taking notes, recording everything. They had sympathy for Lewis's obvious remorse, but they had seen the crime scene, had seen what he had done to Susan Layton. Remorse after the fact didn't undo the horror of those 7 stab wounds, didn't bring back a 19-year-old girl who had died in terror and agony. Lewis provided details only the killers would know. The exact location of the bodies in the freezer. The fact that Bass had been shot in the head last. the amount of money they had taken from the safe. All of this corroborated what investigators had found at the scene and confirmed Lewis's involvement. Darrell Williams, by contrast, refused to cooperate. He denied everything, claimed he had nothing to do with the murders, insisted that the police had the wrong man. When confronted with evidence, the bloody clothes in the car, the fingerprints at the scene, Lewis's confession, Williams called it all lies and fabrication. He demanded a lawyer and refused to answer any more questions. But his refusal to confess didn't matter. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Lewis's detailed confession, the physical evidence, the witness testimony, all of it pointed to Williams as the mastermind and primary killer in the cold storage murders. Both men were formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, robbery, and kidnapping. They were extradited back to Iowa to face trial in Kossuth County, where the crimes had occurred. The extradition happened under heavy security. There were genuine concerns that someone from Algona, a family member of one of the victims, or just an outraged citizen, might try to attack Williams and Lewis during transport. The anger in the community was palpable and intense. Some people talked openly about lynching, about the old days when justice was swift and final. Others argued for letting the legal system work, for ensuring that Williams and Lewis faced proper trials and formal punishment. When Williams and Lewis arrived at the Kossuth County Jail, they were placed in separate cells under 24-hour watch. The jail wasn't designed to hold high-profile murder suspects. It was a small facility that normally housed people arrested for drunk driving, minor assaults, or failure to pay child support. But security was enhanced as much as possible, with extra guards and strict protocols for who could have access to the prisoners. The legal proceedings began quickly. Both men were assigned public defenders, as neither had money for private attorneys. The county prosecutor, a veteran attorney named James Morrison who had handled many criminal cases over his 20-year career but never a double murder, began preparing the state's case. Morrison knew this would be the most important trial of his career, and possibly the most important trial in Kossuth County history. The evidence was strong, but he wanted to be absolutely certain that nothing would go wrong, that no technicalities or procedural errors would allow Williams and Lewis to escape justice. He worked with the investigators to organize all the evidence, to ensure the chain of custody was documented for every piece of physical evidence, to prepare every witness who would testify. He reviewed Lewis's confession in detail, making sure it would be admissible in court. He consulted with the medical examiner to ensure the autopsy findings would be presented clearly and convincingly to a jury. Meanwhile, the defense attorneys faced an almost impossible task. Their clients were guilty, one had even confessed. The evidence was overwhelming. Public sentiment was completely against them. But they had an ethical and legal obligation to provide the best defense possible, to ensure their clients' rights were protected, to make the state prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The attorney representing Robert Lewis, a young public defender named Sarah Collins who had only been practicing law for 3 years, met with her client and listened to his tearful admission of guilt. She advised him that given his confession and the evidence, his best option might be to plead guilty in exchange for a recommendation of life in prison rather than the death penalty. Lewis agreed almost immediately. He wanted to accept responsibility for what he had done, wanted to spare the victims the family of a trial, wanted to avoid the possibility of execution. The attorney representing Darrell Williams, an experienced public defender named Thomas Brennan who had handled many difficult cases, faced a harder challenge. Williams insisted on his innocence despite all evidence to the contrary, and wanted to fight the charges at trial. Brennan tried to explain the reality of the situation, the physical evidence, Lewis's confession, the witness testimony, but Williams refused to accept it. He believed he could convince a jury that he was innocent, or at least create enough reasonable doubt to avoid conviction. Brennan knew this was delusional, but he had to respect his client's wishes. If Williams wanted a trial, he would get a trial, and Brennan would do his best to defend him even though he privately believed the case was unwinnable. Before the trial could begin, however, there was the matter of Robert Lewis's guilty plea. In early May 1972, about 6 weeks after the murders, Lewis appeared before Judge Harold Matthews in Kossuth County District Court. The courtroom was packed with spectators, family members of the victims, curious citizens, reporters from newspapers and television stations across Iowa. Lewis, dressed in an orange jail jumpsuit and shackled at the wrists and ankles, stood before the judge and admitted his guilt. His voice was quiet and shaking as he answered the judge's questions. "Mr. Lewis, do you understand that by pleading guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, you are admitting that you intentionally and with premeditation killed Gordon Bass and Susan Layton?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you understand that first-degree murder in Iowa carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Has anyone forced or coerced you to enter this plea?" "No, Your Honor." "Are you entering this plea of your own free will?" "Yes, Your Honor, I'm guilty. I killed Susan Layton. I helped kill Mr. Bass." "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Lewis began crying, his shoulders shaking with sobs. The judge waited a moment for him to compose himself, then continued. "Mr. Lewis, is there anything you would like to say to the court or to the families of the victims?" Lewis turned toward where the Bass and Layton families sat in the front rows of the courtroom gallery. Through his tears, he tried to speak. "I know saying I'm sorry doesn't mean anything," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I can't take back what I did. I wish I could. I wish I had never met Darrell Williams. I wish I had never gone to that cold storage. I wish I could trade places with Susan, could give her back her life. But I can't. All I can do is accept responsibility and spend the rest of my life regretting what I did. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Susan Layton's mother screamed at him from the gallery. "Sorry. You're sorry. You murdered my baby. You stabbed her to death while she begged for her life. Sorry doesn't bring her back." "Sorry doesn't," she collapsed, sobbing, into her husband's arms. The judge gaveled for order, waiting for the courtroom to quiet. Then Judge Matthews pronounced sentence. "Robert Lewis, having pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on each count, to be served consecutively. You will spend the rest of your natural life in prison. May God have mercy on your soul." Lewis was led out of the courtroom, still crying, back to his cell. One killer had been sentenced. Now all attention turned to the trial of Darrell Williams, the man who had masterminded the robbery and fired the shots that killed Gordon Bass. Williams's trial was scheduled for August 1972, giving both prosecution and defense time to prepare. Prosecutor Morrison assembled his case methodically. He had physical evidence, the fingerprints, the bloody clothes, the murder weapon. He had witness testimony placing Williams and Lewis near the scene. He had Lewis's confession implicating Williams as the shooter and the planner. And he had motive, Williams's resentment of his employer, his need for money, his criminal history showing a pattern of escalating violence. The defense, meanwhile, struggled to develop any coherent strategy. Williams insisted on testifying on his own behalf, despite his attorney's strong advice against it. Williams believed he could charm the jury, could convince them that he was innocent, that Lewis was lying to save himself, that the evidence had been planted or misinterpreted. Brennan knew this was a disaster in the making, but he couldn't prevent his client from testifying if Williams insisted on it. All he could do was try to prepare Williams for cross-examination and hope for the best. The trial began on August 14, 1972. The courtroom was even more packed than it had been for Lewis's guilty plea. The judge had to bring in extra chairs to accommodate all the spectators. Security was tight, with sheriff's deputies stationed throughout the courtroom and outside the building. Jury selection took 3 days. The defense tried to exclude anyone who had strong opinions about the case, anyone who had known the victims personally, anyone who admitted they couldn't be impartial. But in a town as small as Algona, almost everyone knew Gordon Bass or Susan Layton, or knew someone who knew them. Finding 12 impartial jurors was nearly impossible. Eventually, a jury was seated, 8 men and 4 women, mostly farmers and small business owners, solid middle-class citizens who took their responsibility seriously. They were instructed not to read newspaper coverage of the trial, not to discuss the case with anyone, to base their verdict solely on the evidence presented in court. The prosecution's opening statement was powerful and straightforward. James Morrison stood before the jury and laid out the case in simple, devastating terms. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about cold-blooded murder committed for money. On March 28, 1972, Darrell Williams and his accomplice Robert Lewis entered the livestock growers' cold storage with a plan to rob and kill. They bound and gagged their victims, Gordon Bass, a 58-year-old businessman who had given Williams a job when no one else would, and Susan Layton, a 19-year girl whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They marched these people into a freezer and executed them. Gordon Bass was shot 3 times. Susan Layton was shot once, and when the gun ran out of bullets, she was stabbed to death with a knife. They died in terror and pain, begging for mercy that never came. And why? For $1,800. The defendants killed 2 innocent people for less than $1,000 each. Over the next few days, you will hear testimony and see evidence that proves beyond any doubt that Darrell Williams is guilty of these murders. And when you have heard all the evidence, I will ask you to return the only verdict that justice demands: guilty on all counts. The defense's opening statement was weaker and less focused. Thomas Brennan tried to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that Lewis had committed the murders alone and was now trying to blame Williams to reduce his own guilt, suggesting that the evidence didn't definitively prove Williams's involvement. But even as he spoke, Brennan could see the skepticism in the jurors' faces. They didn't believe him, and he could hardly blame them. The prosecution began calling witnesses. Harold Peterson testified about discovering the bodies, his voice still shaking months later as he described what he had seen in that freezer. The medical examiner testified about the injuries Bass and Susan had sustained, the suffering they must have endured. Crime scene investigators testified about the evidence collected at the scene. Fingerprint experts testified that Williams's prints had been found on the safe and on surfaces throughout the cold storage. The witness who had seen Williams and Lewis near the cold storage on the afternoon of the murders testified, positively identifying both men. The gas station clerk who had sold them fuel on the day before the murders testified. The motel clerk in Kansas City who had recognized them and called police testified. And then, most devastatingly, the prosecution called Robert Lewis himself to testify. Lewis was brought into the courtroom in shackles and prison clothing, looking thin and haggard. He had been in jail for nearly 5 months, and the experience had aged him. He took the witness stand, was sworn in, and at Morrison's prompting began to tell his story. He described meeting Williams, how Williams had recruited him for the robbery, how they had planned it together over weeks. He described using drugs on the day of the murders to build up their courage. He described entering the cold storage, surprising Bass and Susan, binding them, taking them to the freezer, and then he described the murders themselves, his voice dropping to barely a whisper as he recounted the shots, the screams, the blood. He described Williams shooting Bass and Susan, the gun running empty, Williams ordering him to finish killing Susan with the knife. "I didn't want to do it," Lewis said, tears streaming down his face. "But Darrell told me I had to. He said we couldn't leave her alive. He said if I didn't do it, he'd kill me too. So I did it. I stabbed her. I killed her." Morrison asked, "And you're certain it was Darrell Williams who shot Gordon Bass and Susan Layton?" "Yes. Absolutely certain. I watched him do it." "And you're certain it was Darrell Williams who ordered you to kill Susan Layton with the knife?" "Yes, he ordered me to do it." The courtroom was silent except for quiet sobbing from the victims' families. The jury sat transfixed, several jurors wiping tears from their eyes as they listened to the horror Lewis described. Then it was the defense's turn to cross-examine. Brennan tried to undermine Lewis's credibility, pointing out that he was a convicted murderer himself, that he had a deal with the prosecution, that he was testifying to save himself from the death penalty. But Lewis didn't waver in his story. He admitted he was guilty, admitted he deserved his life sentence, insisted he was telling the truth about Williams's role in the murders. The prosecution rested its case after 6 days of testimony. The evidence against Williams was overwhelming. Now it was the defense's turn. Brennan called only a few witnesses, character witnesses who testified that Williams had never seemed violent when they knew him, that he had seemed like a normal if troubled young man. But these witnesses were weak under cross-examination, admitting they hadn't known Williams well, admitting they were aware of his criminal record. And then Williams himself took the stand. Against his attorney's advice, against all common sense, Darrell Williams insisted on testifying in his own defense. He believed he could convince the jury of his innocence. He was wrong. Darrell Williams took the witness stand on the afternoon of August 2, 1972, the 9th day of his trial. He wore the civilian clothes his attorney had brought for him. A simple button-down shirt and slacks, meant to make him look respectable and ordinary rather than dangerous. But no amount of wardrobe choices could disguise what he was. The jury had spent days hearing about his crimes, seeing the evidence against him, listening to his accomplice describe in agonizing detail how Williams had murdered 2 innocent people in cold blood. Williams raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. Then he sat down in the witness box, looked at the jury with what he clearly hoped was an expression of wounded innocence, and prepared to tell his version of events. His attorney, Thomas Brennan, began the direct examination gently, establishing Williams's background, trying to humanize him for the jury. Williams described his difficult childhood, his absent father, his struggles in school, his inability to hold steady employment. Brennan was trying to create sympathy, to paint Williams as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, someone who had never had a fair chance in life. But Williams undermined this strategy almost immediately with his demeanor and responses. He showed no genuine emotion when discussing his childhood hardships. His answers sounded rehearsed and insincere. And when Brennan asked him about his criminal record, Williams became defensive and angry, insisting that his previous convictions had been unfair, that he had been persecuted by police, that the justice system had always been against him. The jury watched him with hard, skeptical eyes. They weren't buying it. Brennan moved on to the events of March 28, asking Williams where he had been that day. Williams insisted he had been at home, sick, exactly as he had told Gordon Bass when he called in that morning. He claimed he had spent the entire day in his apartment, sleeping and watching television, and had no idea that Bass and Susan Layton had been murdered until he heard about it on the news that evening. "And what did you do when you heard about the murders?" Brennan asked. "I was shocked," Williams said, his voice flat and unconvincing. "I couldn't believe it. Mr. Bass had been good to me, given me a job. I felt terrible about what happened to him and that girl." "Did you have anything to do with their deaths?" "Not, absolutely not. I would never hurt anyone." This was such an obvious lie, given Williams's criminal history of violence, that several jurors visibly reacted with disgust. Brennan continued, "The prosecution has presented testimony from Robert Lewis claiming that you planned and participated in the robbery and murders. Is his testimony true?" "No, it's all lies," Williams said, his voice rising with indignation. "Robert Lewis is trying to save himself by blaming me. He probably committed those himself and is making me the scapegoat." "Why would he do that?" "Because he's a coward," Williams spat. "He can't face what he did, so he's putting it all on me." Brennan tried to ask more questions, tried to build some coherent alternative narrative. But Williams kept going off script, making statements that hurt rather than helped his case. When Brennan asked about the physical evidence, the fingerprints, the bloody clothes found in Lewis's car, Williams claimed it had all been planted by police who wanted to frame him. "Why would the police want to frame you?" Brennan asked, knowing this was dangerous territory but having no choice since Williams had opened the door. "Because they've had it out for me since I was a kid," Williams said. "They know I've been in trouble before, so they figured they could pin this on me. It's easier to blame someone with a record than to find the real killers." The jury didn't believe a word of it. The idea that the Algona Police Department and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation had fabricated evidence to frame Williams for a double murder was absurd. These were small-town law enforcement officers investigating the most serious crime in their community's history, not corrupt big city cops looking to close a case quickly. Brennan finished his direct examination, having accomplished nothing except confirming what the jury already believed. that Darrell Williams was a liar and a sociopath incapable of taking responsibility for his actions. Then Prosecutor James Morrison stood up for cross-examination, and Williams's testimony went from bad to catastrophic. Morrison began calmly, almost conversationally. "Mr. Williams, you testified that we're homesick on March 28, correct?" "That's right." "Yes." "Did anyone see you at your apartment that day? Any visitors, any neighbors, anyone who can confirm you were there?" Williams hesitated. "No, I was alone." "So you have no alibi for the time when the murders were committed?" "I don't need an alibi. I didn't do anything." Morrison nodded slowly, then asked, "You also testified that you felt terrible when you heard about Mr. Bass's death, correct?" "Yes." "When did you hear about it?" "On the news that evening, like I said." "And what did you do after you heard about it?" I was upset. I stayed home." "You didn't call anyone? Didn't call Mrs. Bass to offer condolences? Didn't call the police to see if there was anything you could do to help?" "No, I didn't think of it." "You didn't think to call your employer's widow after learning he'd been murdered?" I was in shock. Morrison let that hang in the air for a moment, then asked, "When did you leave Algona, Mr. Williams?" "I didn't leave Algona." "You didn't? So you're saying you were at your apartment on March 29, the day after the murders?" Williams realized the trap too lay. "Where did you go?" "Just around." Driving where?" "Different places. Kansas City." Williams's face flushed. "I might have gone through there, Mr. Williams." "Were you or were you not in Kansas City when police arrested you on March 30? "Yes." "So you left Algona the day after your employer was murdered, drove several hundred miles south, and ended up in Kansas City. Why?" "I just needed to get away, clear my head." "Clear your head from what?" "Or from?" "From the murders you had just committed." Brennan called out. Argumentative, sustained. Judge Matthews said, "Rephrase Mr. Morrison." Morrison nodded. "Mr. Williams, you testified that Robert Lewis is lying about your involvement in these murders." "Why would he lie?" "To save himself, like I said." "But Mr. Lewis pleaded guilty. He's already been sentenced to life in prison without parole. He has nothing to gain by testifying against you. He's not getting a reduce our special treatment. So why would he lie?" Williams struggled to answer. "I don't know. Maybe he just hates me. He hates you enough to falsely accuse you of murder, knowing that his testimony will send you to prison for life." "I guess so." Morrison picked up a folder from the prosecution table and pulled out several photographs. Crime scene photos showing Gordon Bass and Susan Layton's bodies in the freezer. He approached the witness stand and held them up so Williams could see them clearly. "Mr. Williams, do you recognize these people?" Williams glanced at the photos and looked away quickly. "That's Mr. Bass and Susan Layton." "Take a closer look, please." "I don't want to look at that." "Why not?" "Because it's disturbing, isn't it? It's disturbing to see what someone did to these innocent people. Gordon Bass shot 3 times and left to die on a freezer floor. Susan Layton shot and then stabbed 7 times with a knife. Their blood frozen to the concrete. Their faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain."
"Objection."
Brennan called, his making a speech, not asking questions. "I'll move on," Morrison said. He put the photos back in the folder and returned to his position in front of the witness stand. "Mr. Williams, your fingerprints were found in multiple locations at the cold storage, including on the safe in the back office. How do you explain that?" "I worked there. My fingerprints would be all over the place. But these specific fingerprints were found on the safe." "As an employee, did you have any reason to touch the safe?" "Maybe I touched it while cleaning or something." "The safe was in Mr. Bass's private office. Did you regularly clean in there?" "Sometimes." Mr. Bass's widow testified that her husband always kept his office locked and that employees were not allowed in there without his supervision. "Were you ever in that office with Mr. Bass?" Williams hesitated again, realizing he was contradicting what had already been established. "I don't remember." "You don't remember? It was months ago." "I don't remember every time I went into an office." Morrison pressed harder. "What about the bloody clothes found in Robert Lewis's car? The jeans with blood on them, the shirt with blood spatter?" Testing showed that the blood belonged to Susan Layton. How did Susan Layton's blood get on clothes that Robert Lewis identified as belonging to you? I don't know anything about that. You don't know how your clothes ended up covered in your victim's blood. They weren't my clothes. Lewis was lying about that too. So Lewis lied about the clothes being yours, and he lied about you planning the robbery, and he lied about you shooting Gordon Bass and Susan Layton, and he lied about you ordering him to stab Susan Layton to death. That's a lot of lies for someone who has nothing to gain from lying. He's trying to destroy me. Morrison paused, studying Williams with an expression of cold contempt. Mr. Williams, you were arrested with Robert Lewis in a Kansas City motel room, correct? Yes. You were found hiding in the bathroom with a knife to your own throat, threatening to kill yourself if police came closer. Is that correct? I was scared. I didn't know what was happening. Why were you scared? If you were innocent, why were you threatening to kill yourself rather than face arrest? Because I knew the police would try to blame me for something I didn't do, or because you knew you were guilty and couldn't face the consequences of what you had done. Objection! Brennan called again. Morrison said. He had made his point. He looked at Williams for a long moment, letting the jury see the contempt in his eyes, then said, "No further questions." Williams left the witness stand, and everyone in the courtroom could see that his testimony had been a disaster. He had failed to explain away any of the evidence against him. He had contradicted himself multiple times. He had shown no genuine emotion or remorse. He had come across exactly as he was, a remorseless killer trying unsuccessfully to lie his way out of responsibility. The defense rested its case. Closing arguments followed the next day. Morrison's closing argument was brief and powerful. He walked the jury through the evidence step by step, the planning, the execution of the crime, the physical evidence, the witness testimony, Lewis's confession, Williams's own suspicious behavior and lies. He reminded them of the victims, of Gordon Bass, who had tried to help a troubled young man and had been murdered for his kindness, of Susan Layton, who had simply been doing her job and had been slaughtered for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The evidence in this case is overwhelming, Morrison said. Darrell Williams planned these murders. He carried them out with the help of Robert Lewis. He shot Gordon Bass 3 times. He shot Susan Layton, and when his gun ran out of bullets, he ordered his accomplice to stab Susan Layton to death while she begged for her life. These facts are not in dispute. The physical evidence proves them. Robert Lewis's testimony confirms them. And Darrell Williams' own behavior, his flight from Algona, his arrest in Kansas City, his lies on the witness stand, proves his guilt beyond any possible doubt. You have a solemn duty in this case. You must deliver justice for Gordon Bass and Susan Layton. You must ensure that the man who murdered them is held accountable. And you must send a message that in this community, in this county, in this state, we will not tolerate cold-blooded murder. We will not allow killers to escape punishment. We will stand up for the innocent victims and their grieving families. When you go into that jury room to deliberate, I ask you to think about Gordon Bass and Susan Layton. Think about their last moments of life, bound and terrified, begging for mercy, receiving none. Think about their families who will never see them again, who will carry the pain of this loss for the rest of their lives. And then do your duty. Find Darrell Williams guilty on all counts. Give these victims and their families the justice they deserve. Thomas Brennan's closing argument was a valiant but hopeless effort. He tried to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that Lewis's testimony might be unreliable, that the physical evidence didn't definitively prove Williams's guilt, that the police might have made mistakes in their investigation. But even as he spoke, Brennan knew he was fighting a losing battle. The evidence was simply too strong, and Williams's testimony had destroyed any chance of acquittal. The jury received their instructions from Judge Matthews and retired to deliberate at 11 o'clock on the morning of August 24. The courtroom emptied slowly, with spectators heading to nearby restaurants for lunch, expecting a long wait for the verdict. But the wait was not long. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. At 2:15 that afternoon, they sent word to the judge that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly with spectators. attorneys, family members, and reporters. Williams was brought in from the holding cell, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly despite his attempts to appear calm. The jury filed in, their faces serious and somber. Judge Matthews asked if they had reached a verdict, and the foreman, a middle-aged farmer named Carl Johnson, stood and said they had. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Gordon Bass, how do you find the defendant? Your Honor, Susan Layton's mother gasped. Gordon Bass's widow began to cry quietly. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Susan Layton, how do you find a defendant? A guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of robbery, how do you find the defendant? Guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of kidnapping, how do you find the defendant? Guilty, Your Honor. Williams sat motionless, his face expressionless. If he felt anything, fear, regret, anger, he didn't show it. He simply stared straight ahead as the verdicts were read. Judge Matthews thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. Williams was led out of the courtroom, back to his cell, now a convicted double murderer. The sentencing hearing on September 7, 1972, was shorter but no less emotionally charged than the trial. Judge Matthews allowed the victims' families to make statements before pronouncing sentence. Gordon Bass's widow, Eleanor, stood at the prosecutor's table, her hands gripping the edge to steady herself, and spoke directly to Williams for the first time. "You killed my husband," she said, her voice shaking with grief and rage. "You killed a good man who tried to help you, who gave you a chance when no one else would." Gordon believed in giving people second chances. He believed in redemption and forgiveness, and you repaid his kindness by murdering him. You took away my husband, my companion, my best friend. You destroyed our family. I hope you spend every day for the rest of your life thinking about what you did, about the pain you've caused, about the lives you destroyed. I hope you never know a moment of peace. She sat down, supported by her adult children, all of them weeping. Then Susan Layton's parents stood. Her father, Thomas Layton, spoke first, his voice barely under control. "Our daughter was 19 years old," he said. "She had her whole life ahead of her. She was kind and beautiful and full of promise. She wanted to be a teacher, wanted to have children someday, wanted to make the world a better place. And you took all of that away from her. You ended her life before it had really begun. You made her final moments a nightmare of terror and pain. There is no punishment severe enough for what you did. No amount of suffering you endure in prison will ever equal what you put our daughter through. But I hope you suffer nonetheless. I hope you live to be a very old man and spend every single day of those years locked in a cage, remembering what you did and can never undo it." Susan's mother, Margaret, was too overcome with emotion to speak. She simply stood beside her husband, tears streaming down her face, looking at Williams with an expression of such profound anguish that several people in the courtroom began crying as well. Judge Matthews gave Williams an opportunity to make a statement on his own behalf. Williams stood, and for a moment it seemed like he might finally show some remorse, some acknowledgement of what he had done. Instead, he said, "I maintain my innocence. I did not commit these crimes. I have been wrongly convicted by a system that was biased against me from the beginning. I hope someday the truth will come out and I will be exonerated." The audacity of this statement, the complete refusal to accept responsibility, the continued insistence on innocence despite overwhelming evidence, the suggestion that he was the victim rather than the perpetrator, left the courtroom in shocked silence. Judge Matthews stared at Williams with an expression of disgust, then began his sentencing remarks. "Mr. Williams, I have been a judge for 18 years. I have presided over hundreds of cases involving every type of crime imaginable. But I have never seen anything as heinous, as cruel, as senseless as what you did on March 28, 1972. You murdered 2 innocent people in cold blood for money. You showed them no mercy when they begged for their lives. You have shown no remorse even now, after being convicted by a jury of your peers. The law in Iowa is clear. First-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. If this state had the death penalty, I would not hesitate to impose it in your case. Since it does not, I must content myself with ensuring you never walk free again. On the charge of first-degree murder or the death of Gordon Bass, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Susan Layton, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively to the first sentence. On the charge of robbery, I sentence you to 25 years in prison. On the charge of kidnapping, I sentence you to 25 years in prison. All sentences to run consecutively. You will be remanded to the custody of the Iowa Department of Corrections to serve your sentence at the Iowa State Penitentiary at Fort Madison. You will spend the rest of your natural life in prison. You will never again be free. You will die behind bars, forgotten by the world, your name remembered only as a cautionary tale about the depths of human depravity. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none. Williams was led out of the courtroom for the last time, his life effectively over at age 24. He would be transported to Fort Madison, one of Iowa's maximum security prisons, where he would join Robert Lewis in serving life sentences for the Iowa cold storage locker murders. The families of the victims received some measure of justice that day, though they all agreed that no punishment could truly compensate for what they had lost. Eleanor Bass would never again have breakfast with her husband, never again hear his voice, never again feel his embrace. Thomas and Margaret Layton would never walk their daughter down the aisle at her wedding, never hold grandchildren she would have given them, never hear her laugh or see her smile. The hole left by Gordon and Susan's deaths could never be filled, only endured. In the days and weeks following the sentencing, life in Algona slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The cold storage facility remained closed for months while the building was cleaned and the freezer where the murders had occurred was completely replaced. Eventually, the business reopened under new ownership, though many people in town could never bring themselves to use it again. Some businesses never recover from being the site of a notorious crime, and the cold storage facility struggled financially for years before finally closing permanently in 1985. The Layton family eventually moved away from Algona, unable to bear living in the town where their daughter had been murdered. Thomas Layton retired early from his job, and the couple relocated to a small town in Minnesota where they tried to rebuild their shattered lives. Margaret Layton never fully recovered from her grief, dying of a heart attack in 1978 at age 53. Her husband always believed she had died of a broken heart. Eleanor Bass remained in Algona, supported by her children and the community that had loved her husband. She became an advocate for victims' rights, working to ensure that other families who suffered similar tragedies would have support and resources. She never remarried, wearing her wedding until her own death in 1994. The trial and conviction of Darrell Williams and Robert Lewis brought some closure to the case, but questions and fascinations remain. True crime writers and researchers became interested in the Iowa cold storage locker murders as an example of senseless violence in small-town America, a case that shattered the myth of rural innocence and safety. Psychologists and criminologists studied Williams in particular, trying to understand what created such a remorseless killer. Williams underwent numerous psychological evaluations during his time in prison, and the results painted a picture of profoundly antisocial personality, someone utterly lacking in empathy or conscience, someone capable of committing horrific violence without experiencing normal human emotions like guilt or remorse. One psychiatrist who evaluated Williams in 1973 wrote in his report, "The subject exhibits classic symptoms of antisocial personality disorder, previously known as psychopathy. He displays a grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, manipulative behavior, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, and a parasitic lifestyle. He shows no emotional attachment to others and people purely as objects to be used for his own gratification. The subject is highly intelligent but uses his intelligence only in service of manipulating others and avoiding responsibility for his actions. The prognosis for rehabilitation is essentially zero. The subject will remain dangerous for the rest of his life." Robert Lewis, by contrast, showed genuine remorse and psychological deterioration as the years passed. Guards at Fort Madison reported that Lewis frequently broke down crying, that he had nightmares about Susan Layton, that he attempted suicide twice in the first 5 years of his incarceration. He participated in religious services, sought counseling, and wrote numerous letters to the Layton family begging for forgiveness, though they never responded. In a letter to a prison counselor in 1975, Lewis, for every single day I wake up and remember what I did. Every single night I go to sleep seeing Susan's face, hearing her voice begging me not to hurt her. I don't expect forgiveness and I don't deserve it. I took a beautiful young woman's life, because I was weak and scared and high on drugs. I let Darrell Williams manipulate me into becoming a murderer. That's not an excuse. I made my own choices and I have to live with them. But I want people to know that I'm not the same 8th 1972. I've found God. I've accepted responsibility. I would give anything, to undo what I did. Since I can't, all I can do is spend the rest of my life trying to be a better person than the monster I was that day. Williams, meanwhile, never expressed any remorse. He continued to maintain his innocence despite his conviction, filing numerous appeals over the years, all of which were denied. He became a jailhouse lawyer of sorts, helping other inmates with their appeals, not out of any desire to help them, but because it gave him a sense of power and importance. Guards and prison officials described him as manipulative, constantly trying to play inmates and staff against each other, always looking for an angle. In 1985, a journalist interviewed Williams for a magazine article about the Iowa cold storage locker murders. During the interview, the journalist asked Williams if he felt any remorse for what had happened to Gordon Bass and Susan Layton. Williams's response was chilling. I already told you. I didn't kill anybody. But hypothetically, if someone did kill them, I don't see what the big deal is. People die every day. Why is it such a tragedy when 2 people die? Thousands of people die in car accidents every year and nobody writes articles about them. Hundreds of thousands die in wars and nobody cares. So why does everyone make such a fuss about 2 people dying in a robbery? It's just life. Death is part of life. The journalist asked if Williams understood that most people would find his attitude disturbing and callous. Williams shrugged. Most people are sheep who believe whatever society tells them to believe. They're programmed to feel certain emotions in certain situations. I'm not programmed that way. I see things clearly without all the emotional nonsense that clouds other people's judgment. This interview only reinforced what psychologists had concluded. Williams was a true psychopath, incapable of normal human empathy, incapable of understanding why his actions were wrong beyond the fact that society punished them. Over the decades, both men settled into the grim routine of life imprisonment. They were housed in different sections of the prison, and as far as records show, never saw each other after their trials. Lewis participated in educational programs, worked in the prison library, and maintained good behavior. Williams accumulated numerous disciplinary violations for fighting, threatening staff, and attempting to manipulate other inmates. The case gradually faded from public consciousness outside of Algona. Newer, more sensational crimes captured media attention. True crime enthusiasts moved on to other cases. The Iowa cold storage locker murders became a footnote in Iowa criminal history, remembered primarily by those who had lived through it, and by researchers studying patterns of violence in rural America. But for those who had been directly affected, the families of the victims, the investigators who had worked the case, the townspeople of Algona who had lost their sense of security, the murders remained vivid and painful. Every March 28th, the anniversary of the killings, Eleanor Bass and the Layton family would visit the cemetery where Gordon and Susan were buried, laying flowers and remembering the lives that had been stolen. The cold storage building itself stood as a physical reminder of the tragedy, even after it reopened. People walking past it would remember what had happened there, would visualize the freezer where the bodies had been found. Children growing up in Algona in the 1970s and 1980s heard whispered stories about the murders, about the blood in the freezer, about the evil men who had killed without reason or remorse. Some of these stories became distorted over time, as traumatic events often do when passed through multiple retellings. Some people claimed the building was haunted, that you could hear screams if you walked past late at night. Others claimed that Gordon Bass's blood had stained the freezer floor so deeply that it could never be completely cleaned, that you could still see the dark marks where he had died. None of this was true, but the myths persisted because the reality was almost too horrible to process without some element of supernatural explanation. The truth, that two ordinary young men had committed extraordinary evil simply because they wanted money and felt no empathy for other human beings, was somehow more disturbing than any ghost story could be. In academic circles, the Iowa cold storage locker murders became a case study in several areas. Criminologists used it to study the dynamics of collaborative murder, examining how Williams had recruited and manipulated Lewis into participating in crimes Lewis might never have committed on his own. Psychologists used Williams's case file to study antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, particularly the question of whether such individuals could ever be rehabilitated or whether they remained permanently dangerous. Sociologists examined the case in the context of rural crime, challenging assumptions that small towns were inherently safer than cities. The Iowa cold storage locker murders demonstrated that violence could erupt anywhere, that evil wasn't confined to urban areas, that trust and community bonds could make people vulnerable as well as safe. Law enforcement professionals studied the investigation as an example of effective police work. The rapid identification of suspects, the successful interrogation of Robert Lewis, the careful collection and preserve evidence that stood up in court. The case was used in training programs to teach investigators how to handle complex murder cases in jurisdictions that rarely dealt with such serious crimes. As the years passed, periodic attempts were made to interview Williams for documentaries or books about the case. He usually agreed to these interviews, not out of any desire to take responsibility or provide insight, but because he enjoyed the attention and the opportunity to present himself as intelligent and misunderstood. These interviews invariably ended with journalists and filmmakers disturbed by Williams's complete lack of remorse, his chilling ability to discuss the murders if they were abstract intellectual exercises rather than real events that had destroyed real lives. One documentary filmmaker who interviewed Williams in 1992 later wrote, "I've interviewed many criminals over my career, including other murderers. Most of them showed some capacity for human emotion, even if that emotion was self-pity rather than genuine remorse. But Darrell Williams showed nothing. His eyes were completely flat, emotionless like a shark's eyes. When he talked about the murders, which he still claimed he didn't commit, there was no effect in his voice, no change in his expression. It was like talking to a machine that had learned to approximate human speech, but had no understanding of human feelings. I left that interview convinced that Williams is genuinely incapable of experiencing empathy or remorse, that something fundamental is missing from his psychological makeup." Robert Lewis, when approached for similar interviews, generally declined. In one of the few interviews he granted to a prison chaplain writing a book about redemption, Lewis said, "I don't want to profit from what I did, even indirectly by being in a book or documentary. Susan Layton and Mr. Bass can't tell their stories because I helped take their lives. The only thing I can do now is stay silent, accept my punishment, and try to live whatever remains of my life in a way that honors their memory. That doesn't make up for what I did. Nothing can make up for that, but it's all I have to offer." The contrast between the two men, Williams, the remorseless psychopath who enjoyed talking about his crimes while denying responsibility, and Lewis, the guilt-racked accomplice who accepted full responsibility and sought to live differently, illustrated the complexity of criminal psychology and the question of whether all criminals are equally culpable or whether circumstance, manipulation, and capacity for remorse should factor into how we judge them. Legal scholars debated whether Lewis's sentence, life without parole, the same as Williams despite Lewis's obvious remorse and Williams's lack thereof, was just. Some argued that the law should distinguish between the mastermind, who showed no remorse, and the accomplice who was manipulated and later expressed genuine contrition. Others argued that regardless of remorse, both men had participated in brutal murders and both deserved the maximum punishment. These debates remained theoretical, however. Iowa law was clear, and both men would serve life sentences regardless of their psychological differences or capacity for rehabilitation. By the 1990s and 2000s, the case had become a historical curiosity, remembered primarily by true crime enthusiasts and people with connections to Algona. Darrell Williams and Robert Lewis aged in prison, becoming elderly men serving sentences for crimes committed when they were young. Williams remained troublesome and antisocial, accumulating disciplinary violations even in his 60s. Lewis became a model prisoner, mentoring younger inmates and working in prison ministry programs. In 2008, Robert Lewis suffered a major stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He spent his final years in the prison medical facility, dependent on others for basic care, a situation he accepted without complaint. Some prison staff reported that Lewis seemed almost relieved by his deterioration, as if he welcomed the suffering as penance for what he had done decades earlier. Robert Lewis died in prison on January 15, 2011 at age 60. His death certificate listed the cause as complications from stroke and pneumonia. He had served 39 years of his life sentence. A small memorial service was held in the prison chapel, attended by a few inmates he had mentored and prison staff who had known him. No family members attended. His parents had died years earlier, and he had lost contact with his siblings decades ago. When notified of Lewis's death, Susan Layton's father, Thomas Layton, now in his 80s and living in a nursing home in Minnesota, said simply, "I hope he thought about Susan every day. But his suffering doesn't bring her back. Nothing brings her back." Darrell Williams, when informed that his former accomplice had died, reportedly showed no emotion and made no comment. Williams himself continued serving his sentence at Fort Madison. By 2015, he was in his late 60s, his health declining from decades of incarceration. He suffered from diabetes, high blood pressure, and early-stage kidney disease. Prison officials expected he would likely die in custody within the next few years, having spent more than 4 decades behind bars for the Iowa cold storage locker murders. But Williams' story was not quite finished. In 2016, something unexpected happened that would briefly thrust the case back into public consciousness and raise disturbing questions about just how many crimes Williams might have committed during his brief period of freedom before the cold storage murders. The revelation that would shake the Iowa cold storage locker murders case came from an unexpected source, a cold case detective in Fort Dodge, Iowa, who was reviewing unsolved murders from the 1970s using new DNA technology that hadn't existed when those crimes were originally investigated. Detective Sarah Mitchell had been with the Fort Dodge Police Department for 15 years and had developed a particular interest in cold cases, especially those involving young women who had been murdered or disappeared during the 1970s and early 1980s. She knew that many of these cases had never been solved because forensic technology at the time was primitive compared to modern capabilities. DNA analysis was in its infancy. Fingerprint databases were limited, and investigative techniques that seemed basic now were cutting edge then. In early 2016, Mitchell was reviewing the file of a young woman named Carol Henderson, who had been murdered in Fort Dodge on February 12, 1972, approximately 6 weeks before the Iowa cold storage locker murders in Algona. Henderson had been a 22-year-old waitress at a local diner, a single mother of a 3-year-old son, trying to make ends meet and build a better life for her child. On the night of February 12, Henderson had finished her shift at the diner around 10 o'clock and walked to her car in the parking lot behind the building. She never made it home. Her body was discovered the next morning in a wooded area about 2 miles from the diner. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten savagely, and strangled to death. Her purse was missing, along with the approximately $200 in tips she had earned that night. The investigation at the time had turned up few leads. There were no witnesses to the abduction, no clear suspects, and limited physical evidence. Some biological material had been collected from the victim's body and clothing, but in 1972 DNA analysis didn't exist. The evidence had been preserved and stored, but it had never been analyzed using modern techniques. Detective Mitchell decided to submit the preserved evidence for DNA testing, hoping that modern technology might provide answers that had eluded investigators 44 years earlier. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation processed the evidence and extracted a DNA profile from biological material found on Henderson's clothing. Then they ran that DNA profile through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database containing DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic evidence from unsolved crimes. They got a hit. The DNA found on Carol Henderson's body matched the DNA profile of Darrell Williams, who was in the database because of his 972 conviction for the Iowa cold storage locker murders. Detective Mitchell was stunned. She immediately pulled everything she could find about Darrell Williams, reading through his criminal history, his trial transcripts, his prison records. She learned that Williams had been living in Fort Dodge in February 1972, working odd jobs and staying at a boarding house, the same boarding house where Robert Lewis had rented a room. Though they apparently hadn't met yet at the time of Carol Henderson's murder, Mitchell discovered something else significant. The diner where Henderson had worked was only 3 blocks from the boarding house where Williams lived. He would have passed by it regularly, would have seen Henderson working there, would have known her schedule. The timeline was damning. Carol Henderson was murdered on February 12, 1972. 6 weeks later, on March 28, and Lewis murdered Gordon Bass and Susan Layton. The escalation was clear. Williams had gone from killing a single woman in a sexual assault and robbery to killing 2 people in a more calculated robbery and execution. But there was a problem with prosecuting Williams for Henderson's murder. He was already serving 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. He would never be released from prison regardless of whether he was convicted of a 3rd murder. From a practical standpoint, charging him wouldn't change his sentence or his circumstances in any way. However, Detective Mitchell believed that Carol Henderson's family deserved answers, deserved justice, deserved to know who had killed daughter and mother and why. Henderson's son, David, was now 47 years old and had spent his entire life wondering who had murdered his mother and deprived him of growing up with her. He deserved closure. Mitchell contacted the Polk County Attorney's Office and presented the evidence. After careful consideration, prosecutors decided to move forward with charging Williams with first-degree murder in Carol Henderson's death. Even though the conviction wouldn't change his sentence, it would officially solve the case, provide answers to the family, and ensure that Williams was held accountable for all of his crimes. In June 2016, more than 44 years after Carol Henderson's murder, Darrell Williams was formally charged. The news made headlines across Iowa and in true crime media nationally. The Iowa cold storage locker murders had been horrific enough, but the revelation that Williams had killed before, that he was potentially a serial killer who had murdered at least 3 people in a 6-week span, added a new dimension of horror to his story. Detective Mitchell traveled to Fort Madison to interview Williams about the Henderson murder. She hoped he might confess, might provide details about what had happened, might show some remorse after all these years. She was disappointed on all counts. Williams, now 68 years old, gray-haired and frail from incarceration and declining health, met with Mitchell in a secure interview room. He was accompanied by a public defender assigned to represent him on the new charge. Mitchell had brought photographs of Carol Henderson, pictures of her alive smiling with her young son, and crime scene photos showing what Williams had done to her. Mr. Williams, and Detective Sarah Mitchell from Fort Dodge. I'm investigating the murder of Carol Henderson, which occurred on February 12, 1972. DNA evidence from the crime scene matches your DNA profile. Can you tell me what happened that night? Williams looked at the photographs with no visible emotion. I don't know anything about that. Your DNA was found on the victim's body and clothing. That's scientific evidence that you had physical contact with her around the time of her death. DNA can be planted. I've been reading about cases where that happened. Mitchell had expected this response. Mr. Williams, you were living 3 blocks from where Carol Henderson worked. You would have seen her regularly. Do you remember her? I don't remember anyone named Carol Henderson. Let me refresh your memory. Mitchell pushed forward a photograph of Henderson alive, a pretty young woman with dark hair and a warm smile. She was a waitress at Frank's Diner on Main Street in Fort Dodge. You lived nearby in February 1972. Did you ever eat at that diner? Williams studied the photograph. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or memory. Then his expression closed down again. I might have eaten there. I don't remember. Carol Henderson was murdered on February 12, 1972. She was sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. Her body was found in the woods. Her 3-year-old son lost his mother. Do you know anything about what happened to her? Your DNA says otherwise. Williams shrugged. Then your DNA evidence is wrong. Mitchell tried different approaches over the course of the hour-long interview. She appealed to Williams's ego, suggesting that confessing would demonstrate his intelligence and control. She appealed to whatever conscience he might have, asking him to think about Henderson's son who had grown up without a mother. She pointed out that a confession wouldn't change his sentence, since he was already serving life without parole. She even suggested that after 44 years, it might feel good to finally tell the truth. Nothing worked. Williams maintained his denials, insisted the evidence was wrong or planted, and refused to provide any useful information. His demeanor throughout was flat and emotionless, just as it had been during his 1972 trial. He showed no reaction to the photographs, no sympathy for the victim or her family, no willingness to take responsibility. Finally, Mitchell asked, Mr. Williams, if you were going to die tomorrow, would you tell the truth about what you've done? About Carol Henderson, about Gordon Bass and Susan Layton, about any other crimes you might have committed? Williams looked directly at her, and for the first time in the interview, he smiled slightly. Detective, I've been in prison for 44 years. I'll probably die in prison. Why would I give you the satisfaction of a get out of it? Peace of mind, a clear conscience, the satisfaction of finally being honest. Williams laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. I don't need any of those things. I sleep just fine at night. And that was that. The interview ended with no confession, no new information, nothing but Williams's continued denials and his chilling lack of remorse. Detective Mitchell left the prison believing she had just interviewed a true psychopath, someone fundamentally broken in ways that made him incapable of normal human emotion or moral reasoning. She had interviewed many criminals over her career, but few had disturbed her as much as Darrell Williams. The case against him for Carol Henderson's murder proceeded to trial in early 2017. Because Williams was already incarcerated, and because the evidence was primarily scientific rather than testimonial, the trial was much shorter than his 1972 trial had been. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, testimony from the original investigators who had worked Henderson's case, and testimony from forensic experts explaining how DNA analysis worked and why the match to Williams was definitive. The defense argued that DNA evidence could be contaminated or mishandled, that 44 years was a long time for evidence to be stored and mistakes could have happened. That correlation didn't necessarily equal causation. But these arguments were weak against the scientific evidence, and the jury wasn't convinced. David Henderson, Carol Henderson's son, now a middle-aged man with children of his own, testified about the impact of losing his mother when he was just 3 years old. His testimony was emotional and powerful. I don't remember my mother, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I was too young. Everything I know about her comes from photographs and stories from my grandparents. They raised me after she was killed. They did their best and I loved them for it, but they couldn't replace my mother. I grew up with a hole in my life where she should have been. I never had her at my school events, never had her help with homework, never had her advice when I was struggling as a teenager, never had her meet my wife or hold my children. This man, he pointed at Williams, took all of that from me. He took my mother's life. And in doing so, he took my childhood, my sense of security, my chance to know her. I want him to be held accountable for to admit what he did. I want him to apologize. But I know that's not going to happen because he's a monster who cares about no one but himself. Williams sat expressionless throughout this testimony, showing no reaction to the pain and anger directed at him. The trial lasted 5 days. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Williams was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Carol Henderson. Because he was already serving 2 life sentences without parole, the judge sentenced him to an additional life sentence, also without parole, to run consecutively to his previous sentences, 3 life sentences for 3 murders. Darrell Williams would die in prison, and the world would be safer for it. But the Carol Henderson case raised troubling questions. If Williams had killed Henderson in February 1972 and then March 1972, had there been other victims in between? Or before? Williams had been 23 years old when arrested in 1972, had been committing crimes since his early teens, and had spent periods of time out of custody and unaccounted for. How many other crimes might he have committed? Detective Mitchell began looking into other unsolved murders of women in Iowa and surrounding states during the late 1960s and early 1970s, particularly cases in areas where Williams was known to have lived or traveled. She found several cases that were potentially worth investigating. A 19-year-old college student who disappeared from Iowa City in 1970 and whose body was found weeks later in a rural area. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Williams had been in Iowa City around that time, released from juvenile detention and staying with a relative, a 25-year-old woman who was murdered in Waterloo in 1971 during a home invasion robbery. She had been beaten to death with a blunt object. Williams had been living in Waterloo briefly that year. A 17-year-old hitchhiker who disappeared along Highway 20 in northern Iowa in 1971 and was never found. Williams was known to have traveled that highway frequently. Mitchell requested DNA samples and evidence from these cases where it existed, hoping for additional matches to Williams's profile. However, not all the cases had preserved biological evidence, and some that did had evidence that was too degraded for useful DNA analysis. As of 2017, when Williams was convicted of the Henderson murder, no additional cases had been definitively linked to him through DNA or other evidence. But the question remained: were Gordon Bass, Susan Layton, and Carol Henderson Wilna's only victims, or were they simply the ones he had been caught for? Some criminal profilers who studied Williams's case believed he was likely responsible for additional crimes. His criminal history showed a clear pattern of escalation, starting with property crimes as a teenager, moving to violent robberies, then sexual assault and murder, then multiple murders. This pattern suggested someone whose antisocial impulses were growing stronger, and whose ability to control them was diminishing. The fact that Williams committed at least 3 murders in a 6-week span in early 1972 suggested he was spiraling out of control, that his violence was accelerating. It seemed unlikely that he had suddenly gone from no murders to 3 murders in such a short time. More probably, there had been other victims, other crimes that simply hadn't been solved or hadn't been connected to him. But without evidence, these remained only theories and suspicions. Williams refused to cooperate with any investigations, refused to provide information about any crimes, maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. Whatever secrets he held about possible additional victims, he seemed determined to take them to his grave. The revelation of Williams's connection to the Henderson murder also brought renewed attention to Robert Lewis's claims about their partnership. When Lewis had testified at Williams's 1972 trial, he had said he met Williams only a few weeks before the cold storage murders, that Williams had recruited him for that specific crime. But some investigators now wondered if Lewis had known Williams longer, if he might have been involved in the Henderson murder as well. However, there was no evidence linking Lewis to Henderson's murder. His DNA was not found at the scene, and the forensic evidence suggested a single perpetrator rather than multiple attackers. Moreover, people who had known Lewis in early 1972 confirmed that he and Williams had indeed met only shortly before the cold storage murders, likely in late February or early March. The most probable scenario was that Williams had killed Carol Henderson alone, then weeks later had recruited Lewis to help with the cold storage robbery, which Williams had already been planning. Lewis had been a convenient accomplice, someone with a criminal record, someone willing to commit crimes, someone Williams could manipulate and control. The Henderson case also provided insight into Williams's psychology and methods. The Henderson murder showed sexual violence and opportunistic predation. Williams had apparently targeted Henderson because she was accessible and vulnerable. walking alone to her car late at night with cash from her waitressing shift. The cold storage murders, by contrast, showed planning and calculation. Williams had worked at the facility, knew the layout and routine, and had recruited help to carry out a more complex crime. Both types of crime, the opportunistic sexual assault murder and the planned robbery execution, were consistent with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. Williams was capable of both impulsive violence when opportunity presented itself and calculated violence when planning served his interests. This flexibility and adaptability made him particularly dangerous. Psychologists who studied Williams after the Henderson conviction noted that his continued refusal to admit any guilt, despite DNA evidence that was essentially irrefutable, demonstrated an extraordinary level of denial and self-justification. Most criminals, when confronted with overwhelming evidence, eventually admitted guilt even if they tried to minimize their responsibility or blame circumstances. But Williams maintained his innocence against all evidence and logic, suggesting that he either genuinely didn't believe he had done anything wrong or was so committed to his self-image as a victim of the system that he couldn't acknowledge reality. One forensic psychologist wrote in a 2017 assessment, Williams exhibits a level of dissociation from his actions that is remarkable even among psychopathic offenders. He appears to genuinely believe his own lies, or at least has convinced himself so thoroughly that he is innocent that he can pass polygraph tests and maintain his denials in the face of DNA evidence. This is not typical criminal lying, where the offender knows he's guilty but lies anyway. This is something more profound, a complete disconnect between his actions and his self-concept. Williams cannot or will not integrate the reality of his crimes into his self-image, and so he simply denies them, convinced that everyone else is wrong and he is right. This psychological profile explained Williams's behavior throughout his incarceration, his constant appeals, his jailhouse lawyering, his claims of innocence, his lack of remorse. He wasn't pretending to be innocent as a legal strategy. He had actually convinced himself that he was innocent, that he was the victim of a conspiracy to frame him, that the evidence was fabricated or misinterpreted. This made him not only dangerous but also impossible to rehabilitate. How could someone be rehabilitated when they refused to acknowledge they had done anything requiring rehabilitation? How could someone express genuine remorse for crimes they insisted they didn't commit? The answer was that they couldn't. Williams would remain exactly as he had been in 1972, a psychopathic predator, impulse, empathy, remorse, or moral reasoning, until the day he died. As Williams entered his 70s, his health continued to decline. By 2018, he was suffering from advanced kidney disease and required dialysis 3 times a week. Prison officials transported him to a medical facility for treatment, a routine that would continue for the rest of his life. He also developed heart problems and had to be placed on multiple medications to manage his conditions. Some people, particularly victims' rights advocates and family members of Williams's victims, expressed satisfaction that Williams was suffering in his old age, seeing it as a form of cosmic justice that he would spend his final years in pain and decline. Others, including some criminal justice reform advocates, questioned whether keeping elderly, infirm prisoners incarcerated served any purpose beyond revenge, especially when they posed no threat to society due to their physical limitations. But these debates were academic in Williams's case. Iowa law provided no mechanism for releasing someone serving life without parole, regardless of age or health status. Williams would remain in custody until he died. Whether that was tomorrow or 10 years from now, the families of his victims had mixed feelings about his deteriorating health. Eleanor Bass, Gordon's widow, had died in 1994 and never knew that Williams was connected to a third murder. Her children, now in their 60s, expressed grim satisfaction that Williams was suffering, but also wished he would simply die so they could finally close this chapter of their lives completely. Thomas Layton, Susan's father, was in his late 80s and in poor health himself, living in a nursing home. When told about Williams's declining condition, he said, "I hope he lives a long time. I hope he suffers every day for many more years. My Susan was 19 when he killed her. She never got to be 20 or 30 or 40. She never got to experience anything beyond her teenage years. So I hope he lives to be 90 or 100 in pain every day, thinking about what he did. That still won't be justice, but it's something. David Henderson, Carol's son, had a different perspective. I just want it to be over, he said in a 2018 interview. I want him to die so I can stop thinking about him, stop seeing news articles about him, stop being reminded that this monster is still alive while my mother is still dead. Every time I see his name in the news, it brings everything back. The pain of losing her, the anger at what he did, the knowledge that she's been gone for 46 years and I still miss her every day. When he dies, maybe I can finally let it go. Williams himself seemed indifferent to his declining health. Prison staff reported that he complained constantly about his treatment, claimed the medical care was inadequate, and threatened to sue over various perceived violations of his rights. But he showed no fear of death, no urgency to make peace with his past, no interest in providing information or closure to his victims' families. In 2019, Detective Sarah Mitchell made one final attempt to interview Williams, hoping that his declining health might make him more willing to talk, that the prospect of dying might motivate him to finally tell the truth. She had identified 2 additional cases, unsolved murders of young women in 1970 and 1971, where circumstantial evidence suggested Williams might have been involved, and she wanted to ask him about them. Mitchell traveled to Fort Madison and met with Williams in the prison medical unit, where he was recovering from a recent hospitalization for heart problems. He was thinner than he had been during their previous interview, his skin gray and unhealthy looking, connected to various monitors and medical equipment. But his eyes were the same, flat, cold. Mr. Williams, I'm back because I have some questions about unsolved cases from 1970 and 1971. I believe you may have information that could help solve these crimes and bring closure to the victims' families. Williams looked at her without interest. I already told you. I don't know anything about any crimes. You're 71 years old. Your health is failing. Don't you want to clear your conscience before you die? Don't you want to provide answers to families who have been suffering for decades? My conscience is clear. I didn't do anything wrong. Mitchell tried a different approach. What if I told you that your DNA has been linked to another case? Would that change your willingness to talk? This was partially a bluff. There was DNA evidence in one of the cases Mitchell was investigating, but it hadn't been analyzed yet and she didn't know if it would match Williams. But she was hoping to provoke a reaction. Williams smiled slightly. Then your DNA evidence is wrong again, just like it was wrong about that Henderson woman. It wasn't wrong about Carol Henderson. A jury convicted you based on that evidence. Juries make mistakes. I've been wrongly convicted 3 times now. The whole system is corrupt. Mitchell spent another hour trying different tactics, but Williams remained unmoved. He denied everything, blamed everyone else, and showed no willingness to provide information or accept responsibility. Finally, frustrated and discouraged, Mitchell ended the interview. As she was leaving, Williams called out to her, "Detective, let me ask you something. Why do you care so much about these old cases? These women died almost 50 years ago. Everyone who knew them is probably dead or dying. What difference does it make now if you solve the cases or not?" Mitchell turned back to face him. "It makes a difference to the families who never got answers. It makes a difference to the victims who deserve justice. And it makes a difference because every unsolved murder is a failure to protect the innocent, a failure to catch the guilty, a failure to make society safer. I became a detective to solve those failures, to give victims and families the justice they deserve. That's why I care." Williams looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You're wasting your time. You'll never solve all your cases. There will always be crimes that go unsolved. Victims who don't get justice, families who don't get answers. That's just how the world is. You can't change it. Maybe not. But I can solve some cases. I can get some justice for some victims. And that's enough." William shrugged. "Suit yourself. But you won't get anything from me." And that was the last time Detective Mitchell viewed Darrell Williams. She left convinced that he knew more than he was saying, that there were probably other victims whose murders would never be solved, because Williams would never talk. But there was nothing more she could do. without evidence linking him to other crimes, and without a confession, those cases would remain mysteries. Mitchell did submit DNA evidence from the 2 cases she had been investigating, hoping for a match to Williams. The results came back in late 2019. One case showed no match to Williams or anyone else in the database. The other case matched a different offender who was already in prison for an unrelated crime. So those 2 cases, at least, were not Williams's work. But that didn't mean there weren't other victims. It just meant that if there were, the evidence to prove it no longer existed or had never been collected in the first place. As the 2010s came to a close, Darrell Williams remained in prison, his health continuing to fail, his refusal to accept responsibility as strong as ever. He had spent 47 years in custody, far longer than he had spent free. He had been 24 when arrested and was now 71. Nearly his entire adult life had been spent behind bars. Some prison officials who had worked with Williams over the decades reflected on the strange tragedy of his case, not the tragedy of Williams himself, who deserved no sympathy, but the tragedy of the waste and destruction he had caused. 4 lives ended violently and prematurely: Carol Henderson, Gordon Bass, Susan Layton, and possibly others. Families destroyed. Children left without parents, communities traumatized, all because of one man's complete lack of empathy or moral restraint. And for what? Williams had gained almost nothing from his crimes. The money he stole was spent within days. The sexual gratification he got from assaulting Henderson was fleeting. The sense of power he felt when murdering his victims lasted only moments. In exchange for these brief, meaningless pleasures, he had condemned himself to a lifetime of imprisonment and ensured he would be remembered only as a monster. From any rational perspective, Williams's crimes made no sense. The cost-benefit analysis was absurdly skewed. He had traded his entire life for a few violent pleasure and a couple $1,000s. No rational person would make that trade, but that was the point. Williams wasn't rational, at least not in the way most people understood rationality. He didn't think in terms of long-term consequences or moral considerations. He thought only about his immediate desires and his complete indifference to other people's suffering. This made him dangerous, but it also made him predictable in a strange way. Given the opportunity and the absence of strong deterrence, he would hurt people. That was who he was at his core. Prison had protected society from Williams for nearly 5 decades. When he finally died, that protection would no longer be necessary. But the damage he had caused would linger long after his death. In the families still grieving their losses, in the communities still traumatized by his violence, in the cold case files that might never be solved. As 2020 began and Williams entered his 72nd year, everyone, prison officials, investigators, victims' families, wondered the same thing: how much longer would he live? And when he finally died, would he take with him the secrets of other crimes, other victims, other families who would never get the answers they deserved? Only time would tell. Darrell Williams died on November 3, 2021. At age 73, in the medical unit of the Iowa State Penitentiary at Fort Madison. The cause of death was listed as complications from kidney failure and heart disease. He had spent 49 years in prison, more than 2/3 of his entire life, and died without ever admitting guilt he had been convicted of committing. Prison officials notified the families of his victims that same day. The reactions were mixed but predictable. Thomas Layton, Susan's father, now 92 and in declining health himself, good, when told of Williams's death. He passed away himself less than 3 months later, in January 2022, finally joining his daughter after 50 years of grief and loss. David Henderson, Carol's son, released a statement through his attorney. "I'm relieved that Darrell Williams is dead. He can't hurt anyone else now. But his death doesn't bring my mother back, doesn't undo the trauma his crimes caused, doesn't answer all the questions that remain. I hope he suffered at the end. I hope he thought about what he did. But I doubt he did. Men like him are incapable of remorse. Now he's gone and the world is better for it." Gordon Bass's children, now in their 70s themselves, declined to make public statements but privately expressed relief that Williams was finally gone. that they would never again see his name in news articles or have to think about him filing appeals or seeking parole that would never be granted anyway. Williams's body was cremated at state expense, as he had no family willing to claim it or arrange a funeral. No memorial service was held, no one mourned him. He simply ceased to exist, leaving behind nothing but pain and unanswered questions. Detective Sarah Mitchell, who had investigated the Carol Henderson case and tried repeatedly to get Williams to confess to other possible crimes, reflected on his death in an interview with a local newspaper. "I always hoped he would have a deathbed confession, that he would finally tell the truth before he died. But that didn't happen. If there were other victims, and I believe there probably were, their families will never get closure now." Williams took those secrets to his grave. The Iowa cold storage locker murders case was officially closed with Williams's death. The building that had housed the cold storage facility had been demolished years earlier, replaced by a small park. A modest memorial plaque had been installed in the park in 2012, on the 40th anniversary of the murders, honoring Gordon Bass and Susan Layton. Carol Henderson's name was added to the memorial in 2017, after Williams was convicted of her murder. The plaque reads simply "In memory of Carol Henderson, Gordon Bass, and Susan Layton, whose lives were taken by violence in 1972. May they rest in peace, and may their memories remind us of the preciousness of life and the importance of justice." The legacy of the Iowa cold storage locker murders extends far beyond the deaths of Carol Henderson, Gordon Bass, and Susan Layton. The case fundamentally changed how the people of Algona and Fort Dodge viewed their communities, shattering the comforting illusion that small-town America was immune to the kind of senseless violence that plagued larger cities. In the decades following the murders, the case became a subject of study for criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals. Williams's complete lack of remorse, even in the face of overwhelming evidence and declining health, made him a textbook example of antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. His case has been cited in numerous academic papers and criminal psychology textbooks as an illustration of how some individually incapable of empathy or moral reasoning. The investigative techniques used to solve the murders, particularly the breakthrough DNA evidence that linked Will Everson's murder 44 years after the fact, demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence from unsolved cases. Detective Mitchell's persistence in reviewing cold cases with modern technology provided a template for other departments across the country, leading to renewed efforts to solve decades-old murders using DNA analysis. For the families of the victims, life continued in the shadow of their losses. David Henderson raised his own children with a profound awareness of how fragile life could be, how quickly it could be taken away. He became an advocate for victims' rights and worked with organizations that supported families affected by violent crime. "My mother's murder shaped everything about who I am," he said in a 2022 interview, shortly after Williams's death. "But I refused to destroy me the way it destroyed the man who killed her. I chose to honor her memory by living a good life, by being a good father, by helping others who have suffered similar losses." The families of Gordon Bass and Susan Layton found their own ways to cope and memorialize their loved ones. Eleanor Bass, before her death in 1994, established a scholarship fund in her husband's name that helped young people in Algona pursue vocational training. The Layton family, after moving away from Algona, eventually found some measure of peace, though the pain of Susan's loss never fully disappeared. True crime researchers and writers continue to examine the Iowa cold storage locker murders as an example of how evil can merge in the most unexpected places, how trusted employees can become murderers, how seemingly safe communities can be shattered by violence. The case appears in documentaries, podcasts, and books about Midwestern crime, each retelling emphasizing different aspects: the brutality of the murders, the psychological profile of Williams, the impact on small-town America, the role of DNA in solving cold cases. But perhaps the most important legacy is the simplest: the memory of three people whose lives mattered, who were loved, who deserved better than the violent deaths they suffered. Carol Henderson, Gordon Bass, and Susan Layton are remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived as a hardworking mother, a generous employer, and a bright young woman full of promise. Their names endure while their killer's name fades into obscurity, a footnote in the history of crime, remembered only as a warning of what humans are capable of when conscience and empathy are absent. The Iowa cold storage locker murders remind us that evil can hide in plain sight, that violence can erupt anywhere, and that the cost of cruelty echoes across generations. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night, and stay safe.